In the back, if you can please have your seats, we're going to get started. Hi everyone, I'm Karine Tarzibashi and this is Gil Khouri, and we are the co-chairs of the HBS Day for the Harvard Arab Weekend. We're very excited to see an almost full house at Burden Auditorium, which is massive, so thank you all for coming. We wanted to say thank you again to all the sponsors that have made this possible, our strategic partners, Strategy and also Bank Audi. We also wanted to thank all the speakers for making it here, and obviously the team that has made all of this possible. We're on to our second keynote for the day, that is moderated by Ralph Chami. Ralph Chami is joining us from the IMF, and he will be moderating the session with Shediac and Nabil Lahham.
Nabil Lahham is a partner and senior managing principal at Perella Weinberg Partners, and Richard Shediac is a partner and managing director at Strategy and Middle East. The way the session will be set up is Ralph Chami will be directing some questions to the panelists, and we'll take some time at the end for Q&As with the audience. We'll have 2 micros for you. I also, before we get this started, want to remind you that Strategy End will have 3 tables over lunch for those of you who would like to sit, and they'll have several partners from the region at the tables for you to connect with. Thank you again. And
please join us in welcoming all our keynotes and Ralph Chami.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? Okay. So it's still morning, so good morning. Almost. And welcome to the session on the Arab region, challenges and opportunities. So what we thought we would do is kind of put things in context before we delve into the details. So 5 years ago, most of us were caught by surprise with the Arab Spring. And we thought there were certain lessons that we had learned from that, from the inception of the Arab Spring. At least for my organization, is the overemphasis on the role of growth had to give way to something more inclusive, which we refer to as inclusive growth. And the ingredients we thought for making growth more inclusive were to have a bigger role for the private sector, a greater access to information, greater access to finance, openness to trade, openness to capital flows, enhancing governance, enhancing transparency and accountability, dealing with the festering unemployment question, and providing what we called a sort of an efficient social safety net. So this was the agenda that was put in place about 5 years ago. And what we thought we would do is kind of take stock 5 years later. Where are we with this agenda? Okay, what are the remaining challenges and what are the opportunities? And sort of to help us kind of focus, funnel down into this discussion, I'm very lucky to be working with these 2 gentlemen who've had extensive experience from the private sector, really hands-on on the ground on the various aspects of the ingredients of inclusive growth. So with this, I will stop and kind of ask my colleague Richard to start off by saying, so where are we with this inclusive growth agenda? What have we achieved? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And then Nabil can also chime in terms of from the investment side as he sees it. So Richard?
Thanks, Ralph. I mean, first, just to get things started, I was happy to know that Ralph is going to be moderating this session. We go way back, more than 20 years. I remember I used to visit him at NDU and watch some football games. Go Irish, right?
Fighting Irish, yes.
So I told him, look, I mean, Ralph is a top-notch economist. So I told him, look, Ralph, take it easy on us today. He said, look, I make no promises. So much for friendship. Nonetheless, look, I think the theme that where were we 5 years ago and where are we today is one that resonates, well with me. In that 5 years ago, we looked at a region that we felt had very strong fundamentals, and yet we were talking that we are at a pivotal juncture if you will. Arab Spring, as Ralph highlighted, so we had major concerns about youth dissatisfaction and you all know serious unemployment issues. We had an unfulfilled middle class, and we've done surveys as an institution and others about how middle class feel about their future prospects. And ironically, in the region, the demands, or their demands, were very basic, right? We want a stable and secure country, right? Something that most countries in the world take for granted. And then they talk about we want jobs, right? Jobs that add value, right? So high value add jobs away from underemployment, which is one of the big issues we also have in the region. We also had major concerns about jobs, right? The region needs to generate about 5 million jobs a year. So that's a massive number, right? 5 million jobs every year for the foreseeable future. And we were also 5 years ago talking about the increase in government spend, which sets the stage a bit on where we are today, where because of Arab Spring, there were a lot of social pressures and governments needed to respond to that. And the first course of action, if you will, is let's spend more on our citizens. So we had all these challenges, and at the headline level, if you will, we were eyeing a couple of major opportunities, right? One is how can we seize the demographic dividend that we have, right? We have about 100 million people, young people, entering the workforce over the next 15 years or so. How can we harness that potential for strong economic development and growth? So that was one very important headline opportunity that the region at large was focused on. The other one was around how do we as a region get our fair share of global prosperity. So if you look at the region, we account for about 6% of the world's population, but we only deliver 4% of global output. So clearly, we're not getting our fair share, right? Or we're not delivering on our fair share. And this is a major opportunity. I think the frustration, at least from my end, is if I look at what happened over the past 5 years and where do we stand today, I see little upside, a lot more downside. And that, I think, is what generates a bit of frustration. And we are still talking about some of the same challenges and opportunities. So in this context, as we begin to think about where we are, you add to the challenges that I spoke about a lot of pressure on fiscal discipline, right? So today, fiscal discipline, contrary to the discussion 5 years ago, is front and center, right? With rising break-even prices of oil from a fiscal point of view. I mean, we heard some of that in the oil and gas session that just took place. And even at $60, which is not where we are today in terms of the price of oil, most governments in the GCC do not actually break even, right? With the exception maybe of Qatar and Kuwait. Now, this is again on the back of a 50% drop in oil. It's on the back of uncertain growth prospects, and we'll talk about that. And on the back of even more pressure on governments to spend. Now, and I close with that. If we look at the situation beyond fiscal pressure, we're also in the midst of even more instability than 5 years ago. So, I mean, the war in Yemen, case in point, but effectively, the region is going through an arms race, right? And that has a huge cost element to it. So, we have taken as a region some actions over the past 5 years. We have to do a lot more and quickly. And we'll talk about some of those as we go through the discussion.
Nabil?
So look, from my perspective, a man in the world of finance, the things that we look at, and over the last 5 years, if we look at that and say, look, what has happened? Again, frustration, but predominantly you're seeing it in the numbers. The markets have been very volatile. There hasn't been a lot going on because of just the general term of uncertainty. But today we are seeing significant squeeze on liquidity. What you're seeing are the governments starting to lean on local lenders, pulling out capital, but secondly, going into the debt markets, and those will be supported by the local lenders. So this squeeze is essentially going to create an increase in rates, and as you all know, the region is pegged to the dollar, and as the dollar goes up, that will create, again, more pressure on growth. So, and we're seeing not just that in headline terms. Banks who report are essentially showing a lot of provisioning for NPLs, non-performing loans of corporates, as the headwinds get more choppy. And if you think about the equity capital markets, they have been down between 15 to 30% this year alone, and certainly off at their highs a number of years ago. The IPO market has been effectively shut. There's only been one this year of real prominence, and that was a government-backed bank in Saudi. So, real choppy markets, and even if you think about M&A, which is my world, it's very, very much a defensive posture by companies. Large family groups are effectively rationalizing their portfolios, thinking about how to focus on their core segments. And the whole pressure of competition, as well as new entrants into the market, creating more dynamics of defensive moves. So I think we'll continue to see that in the next few years. I think it's again volatility and uncertainty. Certainly the overlay of the geopolitical dynamics play into this. We can't forget all of that. But, it is not necessarily a doomsday scenario, but it is certainly a challenging time. And we'll talk more about the tools and opportunities to solve for this. But I think, as Richard said, it's been frustrating. And, we all work in the region and are focused on, hopefully a better management in the next 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so we've heard quite a bit on the challenges. Anything on the opportunity side? Because every challenge is really an opportunity in disguise.
Right.
So in terms of opportunities, how do you see it?
I think I think one good way to go about this, Ralph, is maybe to focus on a specific country, right, or at least groupings of countries, right, because the situation when you talk about all importing countries is quite different than when you talk about, oil exporting countries. And maybe I'll spend a couple of minutes on maybe, challenges first, and let's talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia. And then we'll go back and talk about opportunities, because we don't want this to sound like a session around just challenges, because I think the region has huge opportunity, right? And we're all here because of that and because we believe in that. So I think if we look at Saudi, which is a good market to focus on as a representative, if you will, of oil exporting countries, simply because it's the economic engine, right, of the GCC right now, there are certain challenges, right, that again lead to opportunities. I mean, the challenges today are, much slower growth. So we're talking 2015, something around 2.8% growth, aided, by the way, by government spend. So without government spend, it would be less. And 2016, we're saying the same thing, arguably even lower than 2.8%. Budget deficits are high, right? Again, this year about 20%. Difficult to forecast the future, but most would say, more of the same. Obviously, within the context of still very heavy reliance on oil revenues, about 80–90% of government revenue in Saudi Arabia is essentially linked to oil, and pressure right now on government spend. So we're seeing it in the region, in that Saudi is asking government institutions to monitor and spend. They've put a hold onto some of the large infrastructure projects, freezing the public sector wage bill, and what have you. So a lot of that, right, keeping in mind that we have to maintain a very fine balance, right, with cutting spending and maintaining the social contract, right, that we know the government has with its citizens. So that's around the challenges. Maybe we can pick up a couple, Nabil, and then we'll go into opportunities.
Yeah, look, I think, going back to what I said earlier, Saudi is obviously a big influence on the whole region, and their borrowing needs as they grow are clearly going to impact the whole region. The recent downgrade by S&P, which only happened a few weeks ago, I will say kind of a bit jumped the gun, because at the end of the day, as Richard was mentioning, there are certain levers that can be adjusted, and that's the budget. And next year's budget for Saudi hasn't come out yet, and based on what that will suggest, it will give some guidance on how the next few years are going to be tackled vis-a-vis that lever.
And on that, just to interject, because I wanted to say that with the IMF, right, there's this whole discussion, right, with the budget deficits, that financial resources of Saudi Arabia would be depleted, and you guys are talking about something like 5 years in your latest audio. So and I know you have
look,
we had good discussions about this yesterday.
I have a different view on that. I think again, while I talk about the lever of the budget, I think Saudi also is clearly one of the least indebted nations in the world, has built up significant reserves, and so between the lever of managing the budget and managing essentially their debt capacity, I think they can certainly sail through this period, and I think the 5 years is a bit of a headline number, but I think there's significant more leeway in order to essentially maneuver. But at the end of the day, it is significant capital that's being raised. Saudi will run about a 20% deficit to GDP this year. I think the last cycle, when we had a crisis, if I'm correct in my numbers, I think Saudi was running a debt to GDP of 100%. So we still have a lot of room to grow, and there's still again room to maneuver. I think the liquidity squeeze will impact the banks in Saudi, even though it's a very well regulated space, and there's lots of liquidity. There's significant amount of liquidity that needs to support the government. I think there's about expected this just in this year about $1 trillion that will be taken out of the asset managers around the globe from governments and sovereign wealth funds. That's out of about 18 trillion that's being essentially managed out there. So that's a significant amount in just 1 year. So everyone's, at least in my business, looking at what's going to happen over the next few months when they start implementing and announcing the new budget, because that will effectively set the stage for how they're going to actually sail through this period.
I mean, just to clarify, what we published in the Regional Economic Outlook is a baseline scenario. So it says, given what we know right now, it looks like in 5 years they would exhaust. But I think what Nabil is referring to is that he is, I would say, confident that the Saudis would be able to deal with this within those 5 years, which would delay the inevitable, maybe for a much longer time. So this is an oil exporting country.
Yeah.
Why don't we choose
some opportunities?
Yeah, so before we move on, you wanted to talk about opportunities.
Sure. I think, since we're talking about Saudi, some key opportunities, but also just to build on the sovereign wealth fund, the drawdown, the 1 trillion. We spent a lot of time in the past few years saying that sovereign wealth funds in the region need to bring back some of this money to spur economic development. And because, as you know, most of the investments that they make are outside of the region. And it's a bit ironic now that, we're actually doing that, but we're doing that to plug, budget deficits, which was not the initial thinking. So that's kind of a bit of the crisis that I think we're in, notwithstanding how long, things can last, which I'm glad to know is not just 5 years, right? So I think, look, as is, you've all heard during the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, and that's the term everyone uses, is one should not waste a good crisis, right? And I think this presents an opportunity, right, against a burning platform, yes, but nonetheless an opportunity for us to fix things for the long term. So the medium term may be a bit challenging, so be it. What can we do essentially today to leverage the capabilities that we have and the opportunities available to us, for the long term? One of the things that obviously Saudi, since we're talking about Saudi, can do is institutional and policy reform. So we all know, for example, the topic about subsidies. This is a great opportunity to actually address that head-on, recognizing the social implications, and that means you need to be careful on how you go about it. The other thing that they need to do, which they are actually doing as we speak, is look for new sources of revenue, right, beyond just oil. So VAT is a big opportunity. The VAT framework is actually under discussion and very close to alignment between the different GCC countries. So that is coming soon, to the GCC. Another very important source of revenue that Saudi is actively pursuing right now is privatization. So essentially privatization or PPP is like, how can we essentially focus government, if you will, on what they do best and rely more on the private sector and the funds that the private sector can bring in, be it domestic or FDI. And then clearly the eternal discussion around economic diversification, away, right, from oil and into non-oil private sector job growth. Now, and I'm building on the session that kind of just took place. We're not saying that we should not continue to double down on oil. We understand that that's where we have a competitive advantage, but that does not preclude us, right, from focusing on other productive sectors and ensuring that we raise our productivity levels so that we can compete within the region and beyond, and not just be subject to the shocks, right, of the price of oil on a regular basis. So I think these are just some opportunities. I mean, there are many more, but maybe I'll let Nabil say a few things.
I mean, I think if you think about the MENA region, and I would even, add a lot of African countries in there, I think the frontier space, which I will call it this, is probably the last bastion of good secular growth around the world. And I think people in the investment environment, investment community understand this and are looking at ways of how to penetrate this, this corridor, if I may use that word, and take advantage of, let's call it, regional platforms and invest across sectors. And so given that secular growth and the dynamics in the region, I think you have, education, healthcare, retail, F&B, even, financial services in the area of fintech is very attractive. And so there's a lot of demand from international investors looking at seeing these, seeing this real inherent growth and trying to figure out how to be a part of that. So I think this is an area that will continue to gain attention. I think what we need to see also is, technology being leveraged a lot more than it has in the past. I think there's a lot of talent and knowledge to take advantage of that, whether it's through new ideas such as crowdfunding or, again, pan-regional digital platforms. There's a number of companies in the region that no one's heard of, but have been working over the last 4 or 5 years and setting themselves up that are regional, digital, online businesses, profitable and growing despite everything that we've talked about from a challenge perspective. So I think that environment needs to be fostered more. But I go to the real segment of any economy, and that's the SME space. What we see in the region, which is part of the frustration that we were all, I think, talking about earlier, is the lack of lending to that segment. In the world of, the developed world, the OECD countries, typically the banking sector is lending somewhere around 25% of their book to this space. In our region, at best, Saudi is around 2%, and the UAE is around, it's maybe 3 to 4%. So imagine, despite all that, you have a significant, segment in the market. I think in Saudi it's 33% of GDP and 25% of the labor force, and in the UAE it's 60% of GDP and 86% of the labor force. So imagine you have that whole segment that doesn't actually have the typical funding channels. And so this, I think, is a real, missed opportunity in the past 5 years, 5 to 10 years. It's grown, it's got the tools, and it's got the talent. And I think that's an area that I'd like to see, progress over the next 4 to 5 years. I will say, from a market's perspective, going back to Saudi, they have essentially tried very hard over the last few years to open up the market, their capital markets, and allow foreign investors to directly invest. I think some people will say it's a bit too late, but I think it's good to see, and they're spending a lot of time touring the world and giving people a better understanding of how to participate in that market. From my vantage point, that is great, but what really needs to happen is to allow strategic investment into those markets. So allowing global companies with real industry sector expertise to come in and essentially invest in the local grown entities and take them either global or regional in this, what I would call regional platform model. And that, I think, will allow the type of companies and the type of governance that will ultimately be the kind of companies you'd like to see on the stock market and benefit from that trajectory. So lots of opportunities. I think, we're again anticipating and being positive about the direction that, we're progressing on. But clearly the headwinds can't be avoided and need to be addressed at the same time.
Right? I think maybe just a bit of an info commercial, and I don't know what it's like in your space, Nabil, and I know many of you are interested in consulting, so info commercial on consulting. We've never been busiest, right, in the region than in the past 12 months, and if you look at the pipeline of projects, for the, coming 12 or 24 months, it's actually, the healthiest it's been in many, many years. And I'm not talking about strategy and only. I'm talking about, the consulting market in general. So this, speaks to the opportunity out there. So when you have all these challenges, right, and when you have governments that are now against a burning platform, admittedly, serious about addressing them, people like us get very, very busy. So be it, labor market reforms, be it healthcare reform, be it, the VAT I spoke about, be it privatization, etc. So there's a huge amount of work and a shortage of talent, I would say, throughout the GCC and as in all importing countries as well. And we'll talk a little bit about Egypt later, case in point. That is, just, creating major demand and opportunities for consulting firms. So again, this is to speak to the, the promise I think that the region holds, right? And why we love the region, because frankly, we are involved in types of work that are extremely exciting, right? The kind of work that you would not be able to do in some of the more mature markets. So just small info commercial on that.
We'll come back to the kind of but just so that people don't get the impression we're just focused on the exporting side, the oil exporters. Why don't we pick an important country in the region? You mentioned Egypt.
Egypt.
So let's talk about Egypt again, challenges, opportunities, and then...
So Egypt, I mean, a bit close to our heart, because we spent time more than a year ago now supporting the Egyptian government in developing their socioeconomic recovery plan, and which was obviously great, right? As I was just talking about, as something to be engaged in. But the starting point, right, in Egypt, as we think about the challenges, is actually, a pretty difficult one, right? You're talking about a country where 30% of the population is below the poverty line. You're talking about a country where 20% of the population actually lives in slums, right? You're talking about very high unemployment rates, 70% of which is actually in the youth segment. You're talking about, and we had this discussion about fiscal deficits, and we all know how the GCC countries have actually stepped in, right, to fill that void. You're laughing, I know you're going to make a comment, but let me just mention two more challenges, and then you can comment. We also have seen in the past slow reforms, and most importantly, by far, right, a bad record of execution, right? So when I spoke a year ago at the Euromoney conference in Egypt, where we were talking about the socioeconomic recovery plan, you could see that the focus was almost exclusively on, how are you going to ensure that this gets executed? So obviously we spoke about everything you would expect, right? The different sectors they should focus on, and what are the enablers, in terms of infrastructure, and in terms of, technology, and in terms of, everything you can imagine. And people are saying, great, 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 but, what is the superstructure that, the Egyptian government is going to put in place to ensure speedy and effective execution? So that's always, a big thing, right? That comes up whenever you talk about Egypt.
Look, I mean, from the financial standpoint, depletion of reserves, currency devaluation, I mean, these are clearly tools to help move from where we are, forward, but that creates significant pressure on the market. And I think what we'll see in Egypt is, perhaps, again, a period of lack of execution, in my opinion. The pain needs to get worse in some ways. Perhaps, the IMF should have been there, and, the brethren shouldn't have supported as hard as they did. I know that's controversial, but I think, the states, the GCC states that have really come to the foreground, in Sharm el-Sheikh earlier in the year, I think $175 billion of commitments. Essentially, weeks before that happened, IMF was in there and talking about their programs and how they can be helpful and create discipline, et cetera. And that basically petered off. And I'm sure Ralph and his team were sent home. But I think the key is, again, bringing back some discipline into how Egypt moves from where it is in the next 5 to 10 years. It's absolutely important for the region that Egypt, from an economic standpoint, gets onto the right footing. There's a significant amount of opportunities in Egypt, but the challenges right now, as you mentioned, Richard, are things that everyone keeps asking. and there is no real body that is effectively assisting in the discipline element. And I'm not sure what the IMF can do today, but it's certainly interesting to get your perspective, Ralph, as to whether there are, some dialogues happening in that area.
I'm just the moderator here.
You can get him afterwards.
I'm just the moderator.
So you're being a friend today.
Yeah,
That's good.
absolutely. So let's talk about opportunities, because you guys have pointed out challenges for Egypt.
Right.
So what are kind of the opportunities?
Look,
as you see it?
From my perspective, so there is a roadmap, right? That the government has developed. So that's always great news and a wonderful starting point. It's very much about what you spoke about initially, Ralph, which is inclusive growth. And in doing the work, right, we had the opportunity to meet with kind of many influential people in the country, and it was very much around how do we foster socioeconomic development to improve the life of the average Egyptian citizen. So this was always top of mind in the eyes of the leadership. So there is a roadmap. It's inclusive growth. It's centered very much around the average Egyptian citizen. So this is great news. I think no different than many countries in the region, be it oil exporting or oil importing. This is an opportunity, right, to go for institutional reforms. And I think in the case of oil importing countries, this is a very good time, because just like oil exporting countries suffer from the drop in price of oil importing countries benefit, right? So that benefit should actually be leveraged in the right way, so that we can put into place the right policy and institutional reforms. I think this is very important. And then talking about oil, the recent oil find could be a game changer. I'm sure you have some views on that. But I think lastly in Egypt, which is not to be underestimated, I think is the talent, right? Mostly in the diaspora. So we spent a lot of time in Egypt, and there is a huge amount of talent, right? And that talent is ready to engage and help, but they just need the enabling environment, right? Otherwise, they'll kind of give up quickly and kind of go back, where they came from. So, but that's, I think, is a critical opportunity, right, to leverage the talent that exists out there. And let me just last comment maybe about consulting, since I'm here, I might as well take advantage of being on stage.
Feel comfortable.
We've never been busiest, right?
Send your resumes.
We've never been busiest than we are today in Egypt, right? We're doing a lot of work in Egypt. A lot of it around the consumer industries, for the obvious reasons, right? 90 million people and counting, but also in a lot of the sector reforms that are taking place. So again, we can spend a lot of time talking about challenges. We're feeling, big time the opportunities.
Nabil, anything?
Yeah, look, only thing I'll add is, okay, if the commitments what we were talking about earlier come through, the 175, I hope that we will see those being channeled into not just, grant type projects, but specifically in driving things like the SME space, improving the banking sector and its ability to support growth. But you're going to see the basics, investments into infrastructure. The oil and gas space is certainly a very interesting area that a lot of people don't know, but there's just a significant amount of international oil and gas companies, historically been in Egypt, and some of them, doing extremely well. The problem that they face is the lack of currency and being able to take their capital out. So they have been, even pressured on being able to operate at full opportunity. You mentioned the gas find. I mean, that's, about 30 trillion cubic feet of gas. I mean, that's very, very significant. And it's not a long-term necessarily project such as, significant deep water, exploration. You could probably see, soon, maybe as far as 2018, some initial benefits from that. And that's about 35 years of the gas needs of Egypt. That's a big shot in the arm, because today Egypt is actually importing carbon. I think the question really is, again, back to execution. I think there's significant opportunity, and it really means whether it's the private sector assisting, or more professional, an institutional approach to taking advantage of these, significant injections, whether it's capital or new opportunities by such oil finds and gas finds. So cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic. So why don't we talk a little bit about with Iran? I mean, we heard in the other session, on the oil session, they talked about the role of Iran. So how do you guys see, in light of the thawing of, getting the relationships getting better with the sanctions and
look, I think Iran is a huge opportunity. I think for global companies. It's a massive country. It has a lot of resources. It has a lot of talent. And so nobody, I think underestimates how big the Iranian economic influence could be. I think people may be surprised to learn how long it's going to take really to kind of, see those significant benefits. At the end of the day, the oil and gas industry is an important element in Iran, but it needs significant investment to get it back up to the point of where it will deliver the kind of promise that people have in mind. I think areas that you'll see immediate impact on are in the financial services space. So today, just the mere switching on of the SWIFT system, which is the ability to transact between financial institutions, will create a significant amount of opportunity and ease a lot of transactional pain that's in the system today. So I think that's going to be an immediate benefit. The other area I think we'll see is really in the aerospace, the airline industry. I think you'll see a lot of benefits there. They have, I don't know how many airports, in the hundreds of airports, and I have 15 airlines just in Iran that haven't had the upgrade all these years. So I think there'll be tremendous opportunity for companies to go in and assist along that value chain, be it on the infrastructure side or on the technical side. At the end of the day, the banking sector will also need investment because it has been paralyzed supporting the government and its initiatives over the last years. So there has been lack of discipline in lending, but there's significant amount of interest from financial institutions, not U.S. because that's still an area that is a no-go, but regional and European.
Okay. Richard, anything?
Look, I think Nabil covered it well. Probably the only thing I'll add is that if you look at institutions in the Arab world, and maybe in the GCC in particular, but I wouldn't just limit it to that. They're looking at Iran as a diversification play. So they're thinking, look, we may see a bit of a slowdown in the medium term, and here's a game changer potentially, as Nabil highlighted, where we could diversify our business and essentially seek growth, right? And the bet is that the investment and the trade flows that Nabil was talking about will actually more than offset any potentially negative impact, if you will, on the price of oil, right, due to Iran's increase in oil production. So net, there is a view, and the future will tell us. right? If that's true or not, that this would be beneficial, right, to the region in terms of diversifying revenues for institutions and therefore seeking growth beyond kind of the markets the way we define them today.
Okay. All right. So we promised organizers that our session would wrap up in a few minutes. So before I do so, what are the main takeaways? Let's say if you were to project for the next few years, how do you see it?
Look, I think what is clear, right, is that the region is in transformation and transition. And I think one can argue that we have not yet seen a unified vision or roadmap. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. Right? So we talk about how do you optimize individual countries? I think there is value, right, in the future, in the near future, in beginning to think about some sort of unified, vision for the region. So I think this is, for me, an important takeaway. We should also keep in mind that the fundamentals remain strong. So that's why, we're optimistic. That's why we're seeing a lot of business activity. But there's got to be a paradigm shift, if you will, in how we approach, economic development. Again, away from government, more into, private sector-led job growth, right? And lastly, I think it's also important to be a bit careful in how we go after, fiscal discipline, because the problem with fiscal discipline is that if you go at it too fast or you don't kind of, pick the right levers to use, you may actually, create negative impact on demand, right? So I mean, if we assume that demand is gonna, slow down, you actually go about, fiscal discipline in the wrong way. You just make the situation, worse. So, I mean, if you want to think about, the region, 5 years from now, I'd love for the region, to be a model of turnaround and growth, where we generate, 7% plus growth, year on year, where we have a, diversified economy, where we have a vibrant, private sector, where women's participation in the labor force is much higher than it is today. At some point, hopefully equal to men's participation, and where the middle class is highly educated and the backbone of the economy. I mean, that's a good kind of vision to throw out there.
Yeah, look, I go back to what I said earlier. I think the regions. The whole frontier region that I talked about earlier is the last bastion for secular growth of any meaningful size. And if I think about where we were 5 to 10 years ago, from a number of different ingredients and tools to kind of move the whole region forward, we were way behind, whether it's talent, whether it's technology, whether it is sector growth across sectors, not just in a few. I think today the region has more talent than it ever has. I know there's still a deficit, but I think it has a lot better talent across sectors. You mentioned women in the workforce. I think that has improved. It still has a lot to go, but it certainly is a lot deeper than it has. The institutions, although still lacking and we can knock them, are starting to develop. And now we have, regional precedents that everybody can look at and feel, which is, like the Emirates, specifically in Dubai, that are real models of success. So, there's lots of great things happening and there's a lot of good momentum. And I think it's really a matter of how the region wants to take that resource and tools and ingredients for success and use it in the next 5 years. And given the prevalence of technology, I think we may see, faster, progress, or at least there's the opportunity for having faster progress than we have in the last years or even beyond. So it is interesting, not just for regional companies, but international companies. And in my business, I see a lot of, sponsors and strategics, constantly asking about how they can, be a little bit more penetrated in this market. And so it is on people's roadmap. It has the right ingredients, and it's just a matter of, again, executing. Which is, I think, a theme of everything we've discussed today.
All right. I do have some questions for my colleagues, but I promised the organizer that we'd actually open up the discussion for Q&A from the floor. You've been quite patient with our meanderings, so why don't we do so? Let's take some Q&A from the floor. The light is too strong. I can hardly see whose hands are up. And let's take a few questions. What I'll do is the following. We'll actually take a few questions at a time, assuming there are a few questions. And then we will, my colleagues would feel free to respond to the ones they feel best able to do so. I can't see, so.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon.
Can you please identify yourself? And please, in the interest of time, the question should be succinct. I would like to avoid comments that are open-ended, if possible. Please go ahead.
Sure. My name is Samir Shaibi. I'm a master's student here at Harvard University. I have two quick questions about the banking sector, actually. One is directed to the comment that Nabil made on the SME lending. Basically, I want to ask him what's the opportunity and how do you incentivize banks to lend to SMEs in an environment where name lending is mostly the norm? And the other question that I have for the panel is what's the opportunity for development of Islamic finance on the back of UAE wanting to become a hub for Islamic economy? Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take.
Sorry, can you repeat the second part of that question? Because I didn't.
The UAE part?
Yeah.
So I was asking what do you see as an opportunity for the region to develop Islamic finance when you hear UAE wanting to become a hub for Islamic finance?
Oh, okay. So, all right.
Hello, I'm Salah Satari, and my question is taking a step back. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about the economy and finance and whatnot, but what do you feel about, I think a lot of the problems we see are symptoms of a larger issue, and I think it goes back to the employee relationship or the institution and the community and the individuals. So how is it that we can encourage businesses, people who are in the business world in the Arab region to put in best practices? Because I think the duty of an employer at the end is, not just to provide a fair salary to someone that they can pay their rent, they can pay their children's education, or they have to be responsible for that. So if you could speak a bit about how we can encourage those best practices. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe I could see some hands down here. Sorry, the light is too strong.
Thank you for coming. My name is Omar. A really quick question regarding national champions, not in the GCC, but outside the GCC, primarily in Egypt or Jordan. What do you think is their objectives or their missions from your point of view to Asia? What's the kind of relationship that's emerging, especially in Egypt and Jordan, with respect to Asian companies and Asian sectors? Thank you.
Excuse me, let me clarify. What is the relationship between, you're talking about non-oil exporters and relationship with Asia?
Especially Asian tigers like China, South Korea.
Right. And that's, okay, all right. So what could be the relationship? Or what is the relationship? What is the relationship? Thank you. We'll take two more and then we can
Hello everyone, I would like to thank you all. My name is Mohammed Shimri, I'm an engineering student at Penn State. So we have underlined the challenges and the opportunities in the MENA region and specifically also the GCC, that they have this challenge of lack of diversification. My question is, this challenge has been discussed and underlined for a long time now. What is your take on the obstacles, the specific obstacles that is hindering the region from overcoming these challenges? That's it, thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Areen Shahbari. Based on the World Bank, they say that if we close the gender gap between men and women in terms of employment, that could increase the GDP by 25%. That's huge. So my question is, what do you think strategically the best way to increase women employment in the MENA?
Increase women employment. Okay. All right, why don't we, if it's okay with you guys, let's just tackle
So
these.
why don't I grab the SME question? You know, it's simple in some ways. If you were to ask any of the regional banks, you know, some of the, even the larger well-known banks, you know, what are you doing for the SME and why aren't you, you know, spending more time on that sector or that segment of the market? And, you know, after a 20-minute dialogue, you'll really basically understand that they're making so much money in their existing business lines that that segment is, while yes, a profitable and interesting segment, is really, it's really down on the list. And so the government has a big role to play in kind of being the catalyst to driving that, you know, that type of lending. And there's many tools that they can do it. But I think the reason that you're finding the banks also not being successful at it to the ones who are trying it is because they don't have the right systems and procedures and tools. It's not part of their culture. When you lend into a SME space, it's more of a liability business than the normal core business of the bank. So, you know, but it's simple things of really, you know, checking backgrounds, spending a lot of time with these companies, understanding their business models, and really, you know, helping them over their, you know, their growth cycle. My answer to that is, you know, why not build businesses and have them separated to the core banking business? You know, there's a lot of consumer, for instance, consumer finance businesses that have come up. You know, I talked about crowdfunding earlier. You know, there's lots of things that are brewing up, not because, you know, this is a segment that's hard to penetrate. It's just because, you know, the large banks haven't really focused on it. And I think it's a very profitable space. And, you know, I think the technology that I was talking about earlier can be a huge driver of lending to that space. And, you know, I think it's a promising area. So, you know, whoever is interested in that space, you know, should really think about, you know, tools and services in that area, because there are companies doing it. But it's not enough. I think the government needs to do their fair share on it. I think that answers your question, right?
There was a question about the encouraging better institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a critical question, right? The reality is that institutional frameworks in the region are lacking. We, you know, do not have the right institutional capability to do a lot of what we're talking about. And maybe there's a big theme that sits on top of that, one would argue, which is, you know, what is the role of government? I mean, just to make it a bit, you know, more drastic, right? I mean, what do we see, you know, government's responsibility? Is it, right, to build the institutions that support, you know, the private sector, which I think today is one of the main issues we have. So, you know, we are still in the region, you know, government-led economies, right? And that creates, you know, less of a pressure or less of a need from government's perspective to actually create efficient and effective institutions to support economic development, because they see themselves as the primary engines of economic development. And that is the paradigm shift that I was talking about before, right? We got to change, right, and say, look, we are enablers, right? And it is the private sector that needs to take the lead in, driving socioeconomic development, and we need to have the best institutions to support them. So I think it's very much around, how governments, see themselves in the economy, and how do we essentially push the onus more towards the private sector. So I think there's that big theme out there that is important to keep in mind. In terms of, and maybe I can pick that up a little bit, in terms of economic diversification, right? And what do we need to do? Again, at the high level, and we've had these discussions, in the past few days, around the oil curse, right? So we have all these oil revenues coming in, and we feel that that's gonna stay around forever, despite the cycles we've been through over the many decades. We still kind of don't seem to learn our lesson, and we know the situation we're in today, and the whole session I think touched on that. Economic diversification at the end of the day is around building capability so that we can compete, again, not just regionally, but globally in our chosen, sectors of focus. So sustainable capabilities across, sectors away from energy. And that takes you very quickly, back to education, for example. It takes you very quickly back to incentives. Okay, what kind of incentives can government provide, to kickstart a lot of these sectors? Something that again is lacking today. It takes you quickly into FDI, right? How can we, again, encourage institutions outside of the region to come and invest in the region so that they can bring the know-how and get us started, right, in certain sectors where we just don't have the capability today, etc. So there are a lot of things that I think governments can help enact so that we can move in the direction of economic diversification.
There was a question on the Asian tigers relationship with the...
Just a quick point on what Richard just mentioned. I think, a lot of the obstacles that are, inhibiting the right path in certain, development areas are not just going to fall away because somehow, people within government see the light. I think, at least in my business, we see that even from foreign investors, as they come in to try and invest in a space that they think is very, very promising, that whole process of actually going through that actually creates some breathing space for others to come behind. So I think, for a country like Saudi, for instance, which has been very difficult for foreign investors to go into, just this year, TPG, which is a very large global private equity firm, saw a very interesting opportunity to go into one of the largest homegrown hamburger sandwich business in Saudi, which is, a billion-plus type of business. Significant opportunity, low-hanging fruit to change it, to diversify it and the menu and improve it like they've done with Burger King, which is one of their key successful investments. They essentially spent 2 years, okay, and there's not a lot of private equity firms who have that appetite to go into a frontier market. They got plenty of other opportunities around the world, but this was a 2-year process to try and find the right mechanism and structure to get the exposure that they wanted. And I think there was a lot of lessons learned from that. So I think pressure from the outside, is going to be a very important, element in essentially breaking through these obstacles, because they're not going to fall away just by themselves. Hitting on the question about Asia, today, if you think about the oil exporting countries, 70 to 80% of that oil is going to Asia. So by definition, there's this Sino-MENA, relationship that is inherent by that basic trade. Significant amount of capital has been invested in Asia by the Middle East, specifically by the sovereign funds. Just this year, I advised on a transaction related to, the Qatar Investment Authority going into Hong Kong Electric, which is the utility there. These are just types of investments that they're doing, and I think they will continue to do that because they're recycling some of those dollars that they're receiving from the oil. It is a very important part of the world for the Middle East, and I think it will continue. But I think over the next 3 to 5 years, given where we've just talked about capital being called back, that will subside for a little bit because the money is needed for supporting government deficits. But it is a very strong relationship. It will continue. Even the UAE, which is in the chip manufacturing industry, has facilities in Singapore, etc. So it is a very close bond, and clearly something that will continue.
There was a question about the role of women, because both of you touched on it.
Yeah.
And so, how do you see that role evolving in the labor force in the Middle East?
Okay, tough question, but so from my perspective, a few levers, right? One is around education. So, I mean, we all know that in the region, women are actually, more educated than men, right? I mean, if you look at high degree attainments, you'll see a big, bias towards women. So that's not the issue. I think what we could do better is orient women, right, to study in areas that are closer to the demands of the market, right? So it's not so much whether they've got the degrees. It's more around ensuring that they're oriented towards the sectors that the economy we would be talking about is focused on. So there's, I think, an opportunity to do that. Another one I can think of is around technology, right? So as we move towards more enabled technology, you could have women be increasingly right in the labor force without necessarily having to go and spend 8 or 10 hours on the job, right? Which we understand that often, right, is a constraint, and we as a consulting firm, for example, are all over trying to find creative ways to better engage with women and provide them with a better work-life balance, so that we can take advantage of this amazing talent that's out there that is completely unutilized, if you would. So I mean, these are two things that come to mind.
Look, I go back to what I was mentioning about the SME space. I think women are great leaders, and they're extremely team-oriented and are part of a successful few companies that I have seen that have tapped into saying, look, we're not going to go to typical institutional direction. Let's try and figure out something else. And I think if you create the environment for them, not just women, but men in general and women, if you create the right environment and the tools, they can flourish. And you see that in the Emirates. Again, I call on that as a regional, let's call it success story. There's lots of very small businesses that have flourished, a lot of them run by women, and you know, we just need more of that. I think it's a shame that today we're still having that conversation. But you know, as Richard said, in the professional services space, you know, whether it's in his business or my business, there's tremendous talent. But our businesses are not significant businesses in the economy. You know, if you think about real engines of growth and value creation, it's, you know, it's in real businesses, not in this, you know, in our an advisory side. So I think there's lots of opportunity, and you know, we just need to figure out how that segment gets the right funding and support for the ideas to be implemented. So again, it's not an easy question to address from a standpoint of getting to execution, because that's what really matters. But again, I will say what I said earlier, which is we're in a much better place today than we were in the last 5 years. And with technology and other outlets, I think the tools are there for you know, women to effectively, you know, maybe show the lead on what can be done.
All right, we can take a few more questions. There are no more. Okay, I'm being told no more questions. All right, so just to wrap up, and before I thank my colleagues, so the things that we heard that are kind of different, the role of, for example, I heard from my colleagues the importance of the capacity of the state to deliver is very important. It's not important just to say we're going to do things, but actually how does the state deliver on its promises is one thing. The role of the diaspora is quite important. The role of technology in changing the terrain is important. And the role of education overall in terms of creating these opportunities on which governments can actually, you know, use in going forward. And of course, we can go back to the recipe that we need to empower the private sector. We need better governance. It's all of these things kind of tie up together. And with this, I'd like to thank you all for your patience. Hopefully you got something out of this nice discussion. I'd like to thank my colleagues here. And we can break for lunch.